My name is Malik Rowan, and for 6 years I believed my wife Sierra and I were building something real. From the outside, our life looked enviable. A sleek condo in downtown Seattle, weekend retreats at lakeside cabins, invitations to the most exclusive art openings and charity galas. Sierra was radiant in every frame, ambitious, magnetic, never afraid to speak her mind, especially about how she saw our marriage. She wore determination like a crown, and I was content to be her humble consort, nodding and smiling as she orchestrated our world. I thought that was enough. After all, love meant compromise, or so I'd told myself on nights when I lay awake listening to her voice fill our shared space while my own desires smoldered quietly in the background. She called the shots, publicly and privately, and I learned early on that disagreement wasn't weakness, it was a luxury I couldn't afford. At dinner parties, she leaned forward, eyes sparkling, issuing judgments about my career choices, my wardrobe, even my taste in wine, and I laughed along, offering the occasional self-deprecating joke to soften the barbs. In her circle, I was the background actor, a supporting role in the grand production of Sierra Rowan. I told myself that by standing in her glow, I would share her stardom, but the truth was more insidious. In her spotlight, I was invisible. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man in the shadows was building something far bigger than she could imagine. While she networked at charity auctions and posed for magazine photos, I was designing confidential whispers of code in a windowless home office, sketching out ambitious plans on scraps of paper hidden in the pages of novels. Every evening after she fell asleep, I devoted hours to Verdant Edge, my private AI infrastructure company. I registered it under an LLC in Delaware, routed payments through a trust, and enlisted silent partners overseas so that no digital trace would link back to Malik Rowan. Sierra believed I tinkered with hobby projects and amateur blogs. She thought my side hustle was an indulgence, a pursuit that distracted me from real life. If she noticed the late nights or the occasional excited grin when I returned from a hushed meeting in a dimly lit cafe, she never asked. I became a master of concealment, feigning exhaustion when I was invigorated, suppressing triumphant news when new contracts came through. Sierra told her friends I would never amount to more than her quaint little project guy, and I let her believe it. Her laughter cut deeper than any insult I'd heard, but I cherished every mocking toast as fuel. Each time she clinked her wine glass and declared, "Here's to Malik, our charming little dreamer," I stored away her words like currency. I recalled the roll of her eyes when I explained the technical details of blockchain integration, the amused smirk when I spoke of overseas partners. I documented every slide in the ledger of my secret ambitions. Behind her back, I built an empire. Verdant Edge grew from a fledgling idea to an undisclosed powerhouse within months. I negotiated 2 Fortune 500 contracts in hushed calls made after midnight, drafted white papers that positioned my company at the forefront of private AI solutions, and hired a lean team of trusted engineers who never questioned the pseudonym under which I operated. I filed my taxes under the trust, ensuring that my personal finances remained invisible to prying eyes. When Sierra boasted about her sponsor-funded philanthropy or flaunted invitations to Silicon Valley mixers, I smiled and nodded. Let her think she was the only one with the Midas touch. I watched her ascend, her public persona expanding like a wave, while mine remained a secret current rising beneath the surface. In her eyes, I was the dutiful husband, supportive, accommodating, inconsequential. Those eyes never saw the nights I crept back home at dawn, my mind alight with possibilities and my laptop bag heavy with confidential documents. I slipped into bed beside her, feigning sleep, my heart pounding with the knowledge that I held more power than she, and the world, could ever suspect. This was the beginning of the backseat husband story. I, the man in the shadows, was cultivating a fortune that would one day eclipse every measure of our life together. Sierra's world, constructed on her unshakable confidence, would tremble when she discovered the true scope of the empire I had built while nursed in her shadow. And when she finally realized that the quiet husband she dismissed was, in truth, a formidable force, she would understand that silence can harbor the most dangerous ambitions. In 6 years, she had underestimated me at every turn. Soon, she would learn that I was not just a bystander in our marriage, but a master architect of my own destiny. It started with the small things, Sierra correcting me in front of her friends, cutting me off mid-sentence, laughing at my opinions as if they were punchlines in a comedy routine. One evening, at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, she stood beside me on the dais and introduced me as Malik, whose little side hustle keeps him busy dreaming up gadgets we'll never use. The crowd chuckled politely, and I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and waves of soft piano music, I felt the sting of her words, but I swallowed it, nodding as though I agreed that my ambitions were trivial. In truth, my side hustle had just closed a quiet deal with a Singaporean investor worth $3.2 million, enough to take Verdant Edge from clandestine startup to serious contender in the AI market. I never contradicted her. Let her laugh. Dinner parties became performances in which I was the hapless jester. Sierra would preside at our long oak table, center of attention as always, and introduce conversation topics I had meticulously prepared: emerging technologies, sustainable investments, and philanthropic ventures. Before I could finish a sentence, she would raise her amber eyes and dismiss my thoughts with a witty retort. At last month's spring gala, I floated the idea of a modular AI platform for municipal waste management, only to have her tap her manicured thumb on her glass and quip, "Malik's still tinkering with his recycling robots. Maybe one day he'll catch up." Laughter rippled around the room. I allowed it. When invitations arrived for her new circle, venture capitalists, social media influencers, nonprofit directors, I accompanied her faithfully, proud of her networking prowess. Yet each introduction came with a sly annotation: "This is my husband, Malik. He's the dreamer. Bless him." I smiled and shook hands, and though warmth blossomed in my chest at the recognition, it was always followed by a cold reminder that I existed only as her appendage. Late at night, I replayed those exchanges in my mind, cataloging the faces and phrases. Each slight, each chuckle at my expense, went into my mental ledger, fueling the determination that burned behind my calm exterior. She believed she held the upper hand, and perhaps she did. At least she thought so. One brisk autumn afternoon, while Sierra sipped iced lattes with her friends on the terrace of an upscale cafe, she caught me checking my messages. "Still waiting on that investor call?" she asked, voice thick with amusement. "You know, some of us have real businesses to run." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, pretending exhaustion from my side hustle. In reality, I had spent the morning finalizing the non-disclosure agreement that would ensure Verdant Edge's Singaporean partner could transfer funds quietly. I gave her a polite nod. "Something like that," I said, and she laughed again, delighted at the idea that I was struggling. I kept my composure, even as satisfaction bloomed inside me. She never suspected I was ahead of her by months, that the little company she mocked was about to become her undoing. When she clinked her glass to celebrate her own latest milestone, a speaking engagement at a Women in Leadership conference, I raised my glass silently, a private toast to my hidden triumphs. Her speech was eloquent, her charisma undeniable, and I listened as she recited anecdotes about partnership and teamwork, never once acknowledging that real collaboration requires genuine respect. Afterwards, guests surrounded her, praising her vision and leadership. I stepped back, content to remain unseen. If she thought I was powerless, she was blissfully wrong. By the time she was planning extravagant brunches and collaborating with high-profile brands on social media campaigns, I had just secured 2 Fortune 500 contracts for Verdant Edge. The data centers I designed would process millions of transactions daily, and the algorithms my team perfected would revolutionize supply chain logistics. Yet in our home office, she advised clients on personal branding while I feigned interest, offering occasional compliments and head nods. Never once did she suspect that I was the mastermind behind confidential conference calls and encrypted filings. I let her believe that I was small, invisible, powerless. On the night she announced her decision to cut me off financially, I sat beside her on the couch as she scrolled through our shared account balances. "You know, Malik," she said, tone dripping with false sweetness, "I've decided to reorganize our finances. From now on, I'll handle everything. You can stick to your little projects." She winked at me, certain I would be grateful for the clarity. Instead, I placed my hand over hers and smiled softly, feeling the pulse of my secret empire thrumming beneath my calm exterior. "Of course," I said, "whatever makes you comfortable." She believed she was driving the final nail in our partnership. I believed she had just signed her own defeat. That night, as she slept in the suite of our condo, I sat at my hidden desk under the dim light of a single lamp. My laptop hummed with activity, sending contracts and milestones to silent partners and auditors. In the quiet, I whispered words of gratitude to the man I saw in the mirror, a man who understood that the fiercest wars are waged in silence. The small humiliations, the mocking jokes, the laughter that shamed me before her friends. Each had carved a path toward redemption. Sierra would learn, soon enough, that while she wielded her voice like a weapon, I was building my future in the hush of her assumptions. And in that silent war, I was already winning. Behind her back, I built my empire in whispers and hidden signatures, weaving a network of agreements that Sierra could never trace. Each morning before sunrise, I crept into my home office and powered on the nondescript laptop tucked beneath a stack of literary novels. The soft glow of the screen illuminated spreadsheets that detailed projected cash flows, investment tranches, and development milestones for Verdant Edge. I'd registered the company through a Delaware LLC, its true ownership concealed by a trust in the Cayman Islands, and beneath that, an even subtler shell in Singapore. Sierra thought I wasted my days on amateur side projects. In truth, I was laying the foundation for a multinational enterprise. In those early weeks, I negotiated my first contracts under the cloak of anonymity. I reached out to a mid-level procurement manager at a Fortune 500 logistics firm, posing as a consultant for a boutique AI integrator. Over encrypted email, I described a custom solution that could optimize warehouse throughput and reduce spoilage by 10%. The response arrived in a terse memo: "Let's discuss terms." I felt a surge of triumph, then a calm resolve as I crafted a non-disclosure agreement that outflanked even the most sophisticated corporate lawyers. By the time Sierra asked why I smelled of coffee so late at night, I smiled and murmured, "Just a long brainstorming session." As deals multiplied, I assembled a discreet team of engineers, data scientists, and legal advisors who operated from co-working spaces and virtual offices. None of them ever learned my real identity or my connection to Sierra. I recruited them through referrals and private networks, vetting each candidate in voice-only interviews that masked my accent and my personal history. I paid them with cryptocurrency transfers routed through mixing services, each transaction obscured behind layers of blockchain anonymity. They believed in the mission, revolutionizing enterprise AI. But they had no idea the quiet dreamer leading the project was the same man mocked as the hapless husband at cocktail parties. The company's first landmark achievement came when I secured a pilot program with a Midwestern manufacturer. Using edge computing devices I'd designed in my garage, we deployed machine learning algorithms that predicted equipment failures before they occurred. The manufacturer reported a 22% reduction in downtime and invited Verdant Edge to present at an industry conference. That accolade, delivered under our trade name and a borrowed persona, catapulted us into the true corporate limelight. My heart raced as I watched the press release circulate, knowing Sierra would see the notification pinned at the top of her LinkedIn feed, but she'd never connect it to me. Around the same time, I finalized the structure of my overseas holdings. Through a trusted contact in Hong Kong, I acquired a majority stake in Greenbyte Logistics, a small but profitable freight management firm. Its valuation, just over $11 million, provided the perfect complement to Verdant Edge's emerging portfolio. I routed dividends through a Luxembourg fund before reinvesting them into research and development. On paper, it looked like an elaborate financial shell game. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy to shield my assets from prying eyes, including the prying eyes of a wife who believed her financial dominance was absolute. At home, Sierra remained blissfully unaware. She bragged to friends about my lack of ambition, describing Verdant Edge as Malik's precious little playground. She organized brunches, charity drives, and luxury getaways, each event documented in curated social media posts. She tagged me in pictures. Smiling, supportive, forever in her shadow. I returned each pose with a genuine smile, capturing nothing but that moment of blissful ignorance. Beneath my calm exterior, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a strategist who knows his opponent's every move while remaining completely invisible. The crescendo of my covert operation arrived one evening when Ms. Jolene Carter, my private counsel, slid a thick manila envelope across the table at a discreet downtown cafe. Inside lay the audited financial statements for both Verdant Edge and Greenbyte Logistics, verified by a Swiss accounting firm. The documents detailed my 92% controlling stake and outlined revenues nearing $50 million. I closed my eyes and breathed in the ambient chatter of the restaurant, savoring the anticipation of revealing this truth to Sierra, knowing that her world would fracture the moment she saw those pages. Yet, even as my empire neared its public debut, I remained meticulous about timing. I continued to play the silent husband at every social engagement, nodding serenely as Sierra collected praise and accolades. I never bragged about our success. I didn't need to. The real power of Verdant Edge lay in its impending IPO, which Ms. Carter assured me would value the company at over $90 million. Until that day, I would maintain the illusion of invisibility, letting her bask in her perceived triumph. Behind her back, I didn't just build a company. I constructed my legacy. The man she dismissed as powerless was, in fact, the architect of his own destiny. When the moment came to unveil the truth, she would discover that the quiet husband she mocked had engineered a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. And in that revelation, she would learn that true strength often resides not in noise and spectacle, but in the patient, relentless pursuit of one's vision, away from the spotlight, in the silence where empires are born. The first time I heard the word divorce tumble from Sierra's lips, it felt like a punch to the gut, sharp, unexpected, and utterly devoid of emotion. We were seated at our marble breakfast bar, the early morning sun casting a golden lattice across her tablet screen where she was scrolling through emails from her high-powered contacts. I sipped my coffee, savoring the bitterness, unaware that our 6 years together could be distilled into a single, dismissive phrase. "Maybe we rushed into this," she had said just days before, voice light as air, as if she were commenting on a minor scheduling hiccup rather than the foundation of our life. But that morning, as she tapped the final signature box on the e-filing app, the weight of her decision pressed down on me with dizzying force. She looked over, lips curling into a confident smile. "I filed the papers," she announced, as if revealing good news. "I think we both deserve better." Her laughter tinkled in the quiet kitchen, the kind of laugh that signals triumph rather than joy. It was practiced, polished, the laugh of someone accustomed to victory. I watched her, the woman who had ruled our shared world with her charisma and ambition, gleefully believing she held the keys to my future. "You'll get a little something," she teased, glancing down at our joint account balance displayed on her tablet. Her eyes sparkled with condescension and satisfaction. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing the grand unveiling of Verdant Edge's audited statements in my mind, then reopened them and simply nodded. "All right," I replied, voice steady. I felt nothing but a strange calm sweep over me, as though I were witnessing a scene both distant and unreal. Behind my calm exterior, a cascade of thoughts raced. I saw the precise moment when Sierra decided to weaponize our marriage as a stepping stone to her next venture. I remembered the countless evenings she had leaned back on our leather sofa, recounting stories of colleagues who outgrew their partners. I recalled her curt dismissals of my side hustle and her proud reiterations that she didn't need A, B, or C to succeed, that she was self-sufficient, unbreakable, and always in control. Now, as she excused her own perfection with polished words, she revealed the fragility beneath her veneer. Her belief that ending our marriage was as simple as deleting an app and tapping a button. I rose from my stool and reached for my coffee mug, cradling it in both hands like a lifeline. The warmth seeped through the ceramic, anchoring me to the present. I studied Sierra's profile in the morning light, her sharp cheekbones, the way her auburn hair caught the glow, the confidence etched into her posture. It occurred to me that she had always seen me as a mild hindrance, someone to be packaged with her success, someone whose ambitions were quaint at best. She believed her rise necessitated my diminishment, and now she was proving it. But she didn't know that in the same breath she was signing away her share of an empire I had built quietly, without fanfare. "Sierra," I began softly, my tone devoid of anger, "thank you for letting me know. If this is what you want, then I respect your decision." Her eyebrows lifted, surprise flickering across her features. She studied me for a moment, perhaps expecting tears or indignation, but I offered neither. Instead, I drained the last of my coffee, placed the mug in the sink, and said, "I'll call Jolene this afternoon to confirm the court date." Jolene Carter, the attorney whose Reputation for discretion and ruthlessness matched my own need for anonymity. Would handle every detail. Sierra's lips parted, confusion and a hint of irritation clouding her expression. She had anticipated conflict, drama, perhaps even a public spectacle, but she didn't get one. She had sculpted me into a passive partner, and now I was refusing to perform my role. After breakfast, I walked into my study, the sanctum where Verdant Edge existed in absolute secrecy. The walls were lined with whiteboards filled with algorithms and flowcharts, while confidential binders lay stacked on my desk. I sat down, opened my laptop, and accessed the encrypted portal containing the latest financial disclosures. The numbers glowed on the screen: controlling stakes, offshore holdings, contract breakdowns. My net worth, meticulously documented, dwarfed any settlement Sierra might have imagined. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She thought she was winning a battle. In truth, she had wandered onto the battlefield oblivious. When Sierra returned to collect her things later that afternoon, she found me composed, even polite. She had packed a suitcase and left it by the door, assuming I would usher her out with solemn words and reluctant kindness. Instead, I offered her a glass of water and asked if she needed help with her bags. She hesitated, her carefully practiced smile faltering. I thought this would be harder, she admitted, voice uncertain. I shrugged. Life is full of surprises, I replied. I'm sorry it ended this way, but I believe it's what you want. Her gaze turned inward, as if searching for the spark of courtroom drama she so craved, only to find emptiness. As Sierra stepped out of our condo and closed the door behind her, I stood in the hallway and listened to the echo of her departure. The words divorce and deserve floated in the air, trailing behind her like torn confetti. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the calm that comes after a storm's first report. The world beyond that door was hers to conquer alone, but she would soon discover that the empire she underestimated was not built on sentiment or spectacle, but on silence, strategy, and unyielding resolve. She thought she had engineered her escape. I knew I had orchestrated her undoing. And as the final click of the lock resonated, I returned to my desk, ready to write the next chapter of my destiny. I hired Ms. Jolene Carter, a private but ruthless attorney whose name carried weight in the corridors where fortunes and reputations were forged or crushed. I first met her in a discreet downtown loft, its windows draped in heavy charcoal curtains and its walls hung with abstract art that whispered of power more than beauty. She sat behind a minimalist desk, legs crossed, pen poised over a leather-bound notebook. Her gaze was sharp, unyielding, and immediately conveyed that she had heard everything before and wanted to hear more. When I introduced myself as Malik Rowan, she made no comment on the mismatch between my reserved demeanor and the rumors that preceded her. She asked only one question. What do you want? I leaned forward, choosing my words with precision. I want an agreement that reflects reality, not perception, I said. I need to ensure that my assets, everything I've built, remain intact. My wife believes she's entitled to a minimal settlement. I want her belief validated in court, but with a twist. She will sign away any claim to my true holdings. Jolene tapped her pen against her notebook. You're asking for a performance, she observed. She must think she's winning while the paperwork ensures she's losing. A slow smile curved on her lips. I like it, she said. Over the course of the next week, Jolene and I orchestrated every detail. We drafted documents under pseudonyms, created shell entities to mask asset transfers, and arranged for third-party verification of my net worth that would surface at precisely the right moment. She explained the importance of letting Sierra's lawyer believe he commanded the narrative. Brian Knox must feel confident he's cornered you. He must see desperation in your proposal, a man grasping at crumbs. I relished the thought of Knox's smug satisfaction, unaware that every clause he pushed for would tighten the noose around his own client's future. When the proposed settlement arrived, it was a masterpiece of deception. Brian Knox, Sierra's attorney, had submitted terms that painted me as a man with no meaningful income stream and no significant assets beyond our shared residence and a few joint checking accounts. Under his proposal, I would accept $20,000 in starter compensation and surrender any claim to future earnings. Knox had clearly assumed that Sierra's flamboyant public persona commanded the day, and that I, the silent partner in the marriage, had nothing to leverage. I smiled when I read it. All of Sierra's confidence lay in that 9-digit projection she assumed she'd grab. I signed the agreement before Knox's eyes on the day Jolene had arranged, in a wood-paneled conference room scented faintly of leather and coffee. Knox glanced over his glasses, a self-satisfied smirk curling at his lips. "You know, Mr. Rowan," he said, voice oily, "you're making a wise choice. Few men show such grace under fire." I nodded, maintaining a courteous smile. "I'm just being realistic," I replied. As I signed, Jolene watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. The ink dried, and Knox shook my hand firmly, as if sealing a deal that elevated Sierra's status and confirmed my insignificance. He collected the documents, beaming, certain he had won. After the signing, Knox departed, clutching his folder of papers as though it contained the keys to the kingdom. Sierra flashed me a triumphant look, one born of arrogance and self-satisfaction. "See," she said, voice brimming with vindication. "You can't win when your wife's ambition outpaces your own." I bowed my head respectfully and murmured, "Congratulations." In that moment, she believed she had secured her future. She thought she had reduced me to a footnote in our own story. Late that night, Jolene and I convened in her private office to finalize our real plan, the court date. I watched through the window as distant city lights shimmered, feeling a surge of anticipation. Jolene slid across the table a single sheet of paper bearing the official court summons. It detailed the date and time of the hearing, as well as the docket information. "This is when we spring the trap," she said, voice low. "Make sure you're present. You'll hand the judge the full audited disclosure as soon as the bailiff calls your case." I studied the summons, committing the details to memory. She paused, meeting my gaze. "Remember," Jolene warned, "you can't show emotion. You must appear as unmoved and humble as possible. Let Sierra's hubris do the work. When you produce the evidence, it will speak volumes, one clean, undeniable truth." I nodded, feeling the weight of every step we had taken to reach this juncture. "She'll never see it coming," I said quietly. As I left her office and stepped into the cool night air, I thought of Sierra's confident laughter and the arrogance in her stride. She believed herself queen of our shared kingdom, blind to the foundations I had laid beneath her feet. I imagined the shock that would ripple through the courtroom when the man she dismissed produced an inheritance of proof that he was not the hapless husband she mocked, but the hidden architect of a multi-million-dollar empire. Driving home, I rehearsed my demeanor, calm, respectful, unwavering. I arrived at our condo just as the moon cleared the skyline, slipped inside, and found Sierra asleep in her bedroom. I paused in the doorway, looking at her, her chest rising and falling in peaceful ignorance of the storm I was about to unleash. I stepped back, closed the door silently, and walked toward my study. There, waiting in the dim glow of my desk lamp, lay the final piece of our plan, a manila folder labeled Net Worth Disclosure, Malik Rowan. I placed it carefully in my briefcase, closed the clasps, and whispered to myself, "Let the performance begin." In the quiet, I understood that the setup was complete. And that, when the gavel finally fell, I would stand not as a defeated husband, but as the unrivaled master of my own destiny. The courtroom felt like the final act of a meticulously scripted play, a stage set for Sierra's grand performance. As we entered, I noted the soft murmur of the gallery, rows of unfamiliar faces and a handful of curious onlookers, likely friends of Sierra's or members of the local press tipped off by whispers of a high-profile divorce. Sierra glided forward, every step measured, spine straight, her smile flawless. Her hair was styled in loose waves that framed her face just so, and her designer gown hinted at the ease with which she commanded attention. She greeted the judge with a confident nod and turned to the assembled crowd, lips curving into a triumphant smile, as if the entire room existed merely to celebrate her victory. Brian Knox stood beside her, his bespoke suit impeccable, his posture a study in self-assurance. He exchanged a few whispered words with the bailiff, then turned to Sierra as though to say, "This is ours." Sierra laughed softly, a sound that rippled through the courtroom like a ripple across still water, only to create waves of expectation. She mouthed something to Knox, and I imagined the rich satisfaction in her chest as she anticipated the judge's pronouncement. I, on the other hand, moved with quiet purpose to my own table, pulling from my briefcase a tidy manila folder labeled Net Worth Disclosure, Malik Rowan. I placed it deliberately before me, its crisp edges and professional seal contrasting with the ornate filigree of the courtroom furniture. The judge, an older man whose robes fell in elegant folds, called the case to order with a measured clearance of his throat. He addressed us both, speaking in calm tones that betrayed no favoritism. "We are here to finalize the divorce settlement between Ms. Rowan and Mr. Rowan," he began, as shifting from Sierra to me. "Counsel for the plaintiff, please present your opening statements." Brian Knox rose with practiced ease, stepped to the lectern, and recited a confident summary of Sierra's achievements and the fairness of the proposed settlement. He detailed her career as a public relations executive, her philanthropic work, and the financial imbalance they had agreed upon. Mr. Rowan, he asserted, had no substantial assets beyond the marital home and a modest checking account. The courtroom nodded along. Even the judge's expression softened at the portrayal of Sierra's success. Sierra glanced toward me, her eyes gleaming with victory. The corners of her mouth lifted, and she smiled, as though to say, "See how well I have managed this?" I allowed her that moment, my face composed, my posture respectful, as though I too believed the carefully orchestrated narrative. Behind me, Jolene Carter sat in the gallery, her gaze fixed on Knox, her expression a mask of inscrutable calm. I caught her subtle nod and felt the surge of adrenaline that accompanies perfect timing. When Knox concluded, he returned to his seat with a smug flourish. He believed he had locked down the outcome, a final victory lap around the dais. The judge thanked him, and then turned to me. "Mr. Rowan, you may present your response." I rose slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked to the lectern. The room grew silent, as if the very air held its breath. I placed one hand atop the folder and angled my gaze toward the judge. "Your Honor," I began, voice steady, "I appreciate my esteemed colleague's thorough presentation. However, there is additional information relevant to the court's determination of an equitable division." I reached into the folder and withdrew the first set of documents. Audited financial statements, trust agreements, overseas holdings, all bound together by a discreet paperclip. As I handed the folder to the bailiff, I saw Sierra's smile falter. Knox's jaw tightened. The bailiff delivered the folder to the judge, who took it and raised his eyebrows ever so slightly. I returned to my seat, and in that instant, a hush fell over the room. Sierra's eyes widened, and a faint flush crept across her cheeks. I sat with my back straight, hands folded, watching the judge open the documents. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the soft rustle of paper as he turned the pages. Finally, he looked up. "Ms. Rowan," he said, voice measured but firm, "these disclosures indicate that Mr. Rowan holds a controlling interest in Verdant Edge, valued at approximately $48 million, in addition to substantial overseas assets. Can counsel explain?" The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Sierra's advisor rushed forward, papers clutched in hand, but it was too late. The truth was laid bare. Her triumphant laughter, the centerpiece of her performance, died on her lips and was replaced by the stifled gasp of shock. Brian Knox rose, confusion and indignation mingling on his face. He flipped through his own notes, as though hoping they might transform in his hands. Sierra pressed her palms into her lap, jaw clenched so tightly I feared she would break her teeth. The judge allowed Knox a moment to gather himself, then placed a hand on the lectern. "Mr. Knox," he said, "the court recognizes this new information as part of the record. The previously agreed-upon settlement must be reconsidered in light of these disclosures." In that moment, Sierra's world tilted. The room, which had been primed to celebrate her, recoiled in awkward silence. Friends in the gallery exchanged incredulous whispers. Reporters raised curious eyebrows. The judge's clerk looked up from her pad, pen forgotten. Sierra's eyes met mine briefly. Eyes that once shone with certainty now glinted with panic. Knox sank back into his chair, defeated, while Jolene's lips curved in a slight, satisfaction-laced smile. The judge called a short recess to review the documents in full. Sierra stood unsteadily, smoothing her dress as though to compose herself. I remained seated, calm, folding my hands in my lap. I listened as Sierra's breath hitched, a soft intake of air that spoke volumes of her impending realization. The courtroom, once her stage, had become a crucible in which her assumptions and arrogance were melting away. When the recess ended and we reconvened, the judge announced that the original settlement would be voided and a new agreement drawn to reflect the true extent of my assets. Sierra's lawyer attempted to protest, but the judge raised a hand. "This court values honesty and equity," he intoned. "The papers presented by Mr. Rowan are clear and indisputable." And just like that, the performance ended. The laughter that had once signaled Sierra's victory was replaced by a hollow hush, a silence so profound it seemed to echo in every corner of the room. I sat back, heart calm, knowing that in this courtroom, on this day, the backseat husband had claimed the driver's seat. The moment felt suspended in the hush that fell over the courtroom, as if the very walls had leaned in to hear the judge's voice. He held the folder before him, fingers brushing the crisp edges of the pages, and the gallery waited in taut anticipation. I sat rigidly in my chair, hands clasped, watching Sierra's confident posture unravel as the judge began to read aloud. Per submitted disclosure and verified audits, Mr. Rowan holds a 92% controlling stake in Verdant Edge, currently valued at $48,600,000. The syllables echoed like chimes, each one carrying the weight of truth into the stunned silence. Faces in the crowd registered shock, while Sierra's smile wavered. Her lawyer, Brian Knox, blinked and swallowed, eyes darting through our carefully arranged disclosures. He stammered as he rose, clutching his own notes like a talisman. Your Honor, I, must protest the admissibility of these late-filed documents. His voice quivered, betraying his certainty. The judge held up a hand, pausing mid-sentence of the readings. Mr. Knox, the court has reviewed these documents and finds them in proper order. The judge's calm authority struck like a hammer, decisive enough to shatter any pretense of victory Sierra still harbored. On the edge of my vision, I saw Sierra inhale sharply, her chest rising in a sudden, sharp arc. A drop of color drained from her cheeks, replaced by the pale sheen of shock. Her nails bit into her palm, a futile attempt to anchor herself. She had prided herself on her unflappable composure, but now the truth unraveled her carefully constructed facade. I felt a rush of something vindication tempered by the gravity of witnessing her unmasking and resisted the urge to lean forward in triumph. This was not spectacle, it was reckoning. The judge continued, his tone measured. Additional holdings include overseas assets in Greenbyte Logistics, valued at $11,200,000, and various trust accounts totaling $1,500,000. Whispers rippled through the gallery, like a wave cresting and collapsing in juicy murmurs. Sierra's network of supporters widened their eyes, exchanged uncertain glances, and shifted in their seats. Some journalists scribbled notes furiously. Others glanced between Sierra and me with newly curious interest. The room's energy crackled with the thrill of revelation. Sierra's breath came faster as she stood, drawn to the center of her undoing. Her voice caught in her throat when she tried to speak, an aborted protest, but no coherent words emerged. Knox scrambled to her side, offering murmured reassurances that felt as if he were clutching at air. He flipped through his own files, desperate to find some clause or footnote that might invalidate our disclosures. I watched him with soft detachment, marveling at how quickly triumph can curdle into panic. The judge closed the folder with a decisive snap. Given these substantial assets, the settlement agreement presented to this court must be voided and renegotiated to reflect equitable division. His eyes traveled the courtroom before resting on Sierra, whose lips parted in a gasp. The gavel rose, fell with a definitive crack, and the room exhaled collectively. Relief and disbelief hung in the air, an intoxicating mixture for those of us who understood exactly how it had been engineered. As the bailiff called for a brief recess, Sierra sank into her chair, trembling. I remained seated, closing my eyes for a moment to process the full weight of what had just transpired. Outside my practiced restraint, pride bloomed quietly. I had orchestrated her downfall without a single raised voice. Jolene Carter gave me a subtle nod from the gallery, a confirmation that our meticulous planning had delivered the intended blow. The world beyond those courtroom doors would never quite look the same to Sierra, nor would the perception of who I was. When the session resumed, the judge ordered both parties to negotiate a new settlement framework. Sierra's lawyer attempted to salvage what he could, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. I rose to acknowledge the judge's ruling, voice steady and respectful as I offered no further argument. Sierra's eyes met mine for a fleeting instant, once filled with disdain, now opaque with regret, and I turned away, feeling the weight of every hidden hour I had invested in Verdant Edge. In that moment, I understood that the most potent victories are those won in silence, when your opponent believes you are powerless. The reading was over, and I sat back, knowing the quiet husband had, at last, claimed the narrative. Sierra's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The courtroom air felt suddenly frigid, as if the chandelier's glow had dimmed and every surface cooled to ice. I watched her hands clamp down on the signed divorce papers she had once brandished like a trophy, her knuckles whitening as she realized the trap she had walked into. The laughter that had once buoyed her confidence now reverberated hollowly in her memory, replaced by the stunned silence of her own undoing. I remained seated, my posture unchanging, observing as the full weight of our agreement, so gleefully signed, settled over her like a shroud. Brian Knox, who had strutted in earlier with smug certainty, blinked rapidly as he flipped through the pages of the financial disclosure I had presented. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his unshakable control, now felt out of place in the charged stillness. He opened his mouth, as though to demand an adjournment, but the judge intervened before he could speak. "The court recognizes the agreement as binding," the judge announced, voice steady and clear. "All parties have signed voluntarily. This settlement stands as per the terms provided, and no further claims may be made." The word struck Sierra like a physical blow. Her breath caught, and the room seemed to tilt as faces around her registered comprehension. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter scribbled furiously, sensing the story of the year unfolding. Sierra's eyes darted to Brian Knox, seeking reassurance, but he slumped back in his chair, any pretense of advocacy drained from his expression. Sierra realized, in that moment, that she had waived every right to contest the division of assets. She had mocked my supposed fragility and dismissed my side projects. Now, her own hubris had sealed her fate. I listened to the quiet rasp of her exhale as she processed the judge's final ruling. The divorce papers she had so casually signed, believing them a mere formality, were now irrevocable. She had agreed to 16 ounces of bright chandeliers and fine crystal while discarding a whole vault of wealth, and the court had no grounds to intervene. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the gravity of her shock. This was not a petty victory, it was a transformation of the entire landscape of our shared history. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled. Brian Knox reached across to steady her, murmuring words that failed to reach her ears. She stared at the floor as if seeing for the first time the pattern in the polished marble tiles. For 6 years, she had built a narrative in which I was the passive partner, the amused sidekick. Now that narrative lay in ruins, replaced by the stark reality that I had constructed my empire while she performed on the stage. The judge rose, restoring the solemnity of the courtroom. "This matter is concluded," he said, gaveling the bench. "The decree of divorce will be entered as discussed." The gavel's crack felt like the closing of a heavy book, one whose final page had been written in my silence. Sierra remained seated, shoulders hunched, her gaze unfocused. I stood, with measured politeness, and gathered my papers. Jolene Carter, seated a few rows back, offered me a curt nod, her acknowledgement that our plan had succeeded behind the facade of defeat. As I passed Sierra's table, her eyes flickered up to mine. I saw a flash of desperation, a silent plea for mercy that I could not grant. My expression stayed calm, almost gentle. "I hope you find the peace you were seeking," I said quietly, voice carrying only the barest hint of regret. She searched my face, as though looking for a trace of the man she thought she knew, but found only someone who had reclaimed his power. She blinked, her lower lip trembling, and looked away. Outside the courtroom, the world had shifted. Reporters snapped photos as Sierra emerged first, flanked by Knox, her composure frayed, yet valiantly reassembled. I followed, stepping into the bright afternoon light, where friends and strangers alike paused to stare. Cameras flashed, phones were lifted. A photographer called out, "Mr. Rowan, any comment?" I allowed myself a small, composed nod. "No comment," I said and walked past. The click of my shoes against the marble steps echoed like the final notes of a chamber symphony. Sierra lingered on the courthouse steps, staring down at her phone as messages poured in, texts from friends, news alerts, social media notifications. She scrolled through streams of speculation and commentary. Divorce shocker, hidden empire revealed, Malik Rowan's fortune exposed. With every swipe, her facade crumbled further. I stood at the top of the stairs, hands in pockets, watching her collapse under the weight of her own assumptions. A few of her friends approached me hesitantly, offering awkward condolences. Their faces were masks of uncertainty, torn between sympathy and surprise. I nodded to each, offering polite acknowledgement, then turned and strode toward the car I had parked around the corner. Sierra's convoy followed behind, but she did not look back. I did not wait to see her reaction. The finality of the ruling had changed everything. The narrative thread I had carefully woven had snapped the story in half. As I settled into the leather seat of my sedan, I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. The engine roared softly to life, and I rolled down the window. A cool breeze swept through the cabin, carrying the distant hum of the city. I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The courtroom had been Sierra's stage, but I had directed the play. Her laughter had become her undoing, and she was now left with the bitter realization that she had been outmaneuvered. Driving away, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The road ahead stretched open, unburdened by past deceit. Sierra's shock had been the final act of our 6-year partnership, and I was free to pursue the legacy I had built in silence. Verdant Edge awaited its public debut, and with it, a future illuminated not by someone else's spotlight, but by the quiet triumph of a man who understood that true power often grows in the shadows. As the city skyline receded in my rearview mirror, I whispered to myself, "Silence can build empires, but laughter can seal your fate." And with that, I drove into the next chapter of my life, unafraid and undeniably in control. Outside the courtroom, the pale spring air pressed against my skin as I walked away from the building that had borne witness to Sierra's undoing. The chatter of idling cars and distant horns formed a muted soundtrack to the victory that had played out within those walls. I paused at the curb, resting one hand on the polished door of my sedan, and closed my eyes. The sunlight glinted off the chrome trim, and I inhaled deeply, tasting freedom in every breath. Sierra's footsteps faded behind me, swallowed by the echo of her own shattered expectations, and I let a small, genuine smile touch my lips. I rose early the next morning and slipped into my study before dawn, the soft hum of the city just beginning to stir beyond the blackout curtains. The room was suffused with a golden glow from the lamp on my desk, illuminating folders and notebooks filled with meticulously detailed plans for Verdant Edge's next phase. I poured myself a cup of strong black coffee, the aroma grounding me as I settled into my chair. In that quiet moment, I ran a fingertip over the leather-bound spine of the folder labeled Courtroom Evidence. Its edges were smooth from handling, a testament to the many times I had revisited the documents, reinforcing the truth I had chosen to reveal. My phone buzzed with notifications, but I ignored them. Emails from investors congratulated me on the verdict, and a note from Jolene Carter expressed satisfaction at our flawless execution. Yet I allowed the silence to envelop me, knowing that in stillness lay the power to reflect and to plan. I opened my laptop and reviewed the landing pages my team had prepared for Verdant Edge's upcoming public announcement. Charts and graphics glowed on the screen, projecting revenue forecasts, partnership highlights, and strategic roadmaps. Each number was a monument to years of hidden toil, each strategy a tribute to the relentless nights spent coding and negotiating beneath Sierra's dismissive laughter. By mid-morning, I slipped into a tailored suit for the first time in months. I examined my reflection in the bedroom mirror, noting the absence of tension that had once clouded my gaze. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket and straightened my tie, feeling the weight of fabric as a symbol of new beginnings rather than rigid constraints. I carried the memory of Sierra's smug confidence into the locker of my gym, where I changed into running gear and pounded the pavement along the waterfront. The rise and fall of my chest matched the measured rhythm of my footsteps, and I felt the exhilaration of reclaimed purpose pulsing through every muscle. Later that afternoon, I convened a meeting with my core leadership team in a sleek conference room at Verdant Edge's unassuming headquarters. They greeted me with smiles and enthusiastic nods, unaware that the last time we had gathered, I was a figure of mild amusement in my own household. I thanked them for their continued dedication and briefed them on the results of the court proceedings, emphasizing the strategic advantage we now held. I watched pride blossom in their eyes, even as I maintained a calm, measured tone. They applauded politely, and I felt the satisfying swell of legitimacy as I realized that, at last, they saw me not only as their CEO but as the architect of our burgeoning success. That evening, as twilight settled over the city, I stood on the balcony of my condo with a glass of whiskey in hand. The lights of skyscrapers formed a glittering panorama against the indigo sky, and I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I thought of the countless moments I had sacrificed to secrecy, the stolen hours at coffee shops, the whispered conversations over encrypted lines, and the innumerable instances when I allowed Sierra's insults to wash over me without response. Each instance had been a thread woven into the tapestry of my eventual triumph. I raised my glass and toasted the silent victories that had built this empire, the victories no trumpet could herald. In the following weeks, news outlets buzzed with stories of the ghost CEO, whose hidden fortune dwarfed all expectations. Interviews were requested, but I granted only a select few, choosing my words with the same precision I applied to contracts. I emphasized the promise of Verdant Edge's AI platforms while letting the revelation of my personal story hover in the background, a subtext that intrigued without overshadowing our mission. Tweets and articles speculated on how a man so underestimated could ascend so dramatically. I let them wonder, preserving an aura of mystery that strengthened our brand's allure. Through it all, Sierra remained a figure in my periphery, a cautionary tale whispered among my inner circle. Reports indicated that her social standing had taken a hit, and her vanity projects shuttered as sponsors and partners distanced themselves. I heard that she attempted to reach out through her sister, seeking clarification or perhaps reunion, but I never responded. I had no desire to reopen old wounds or engage in petty recrimination. I had achieved something far more enduring than revenge. I had created a legacy anchored in innovation, resilience, and integrity. One crisp morning, several months after the verdict, I signed the final paperwork for Verdant Edge's IPO. The ceremony was low-key, a small gathering of executives, legal counsel, and a handful of loyal investors. When the bell rang, marking our entry onto the public market, shares surged above the initial offering, validating every risk I had taken in secrecy. I stood by the podium, heart steady, and felt the room's energy shift from anticipation to celebration. As cameras clicked and congratulations flowed, I thought back to the nights when no one believed in my vision and smiled inwardly at the distance I had traveled. That night, I dined at a quiet restaurant by the harbor, accompanied only by my favorite jazz record playing softly through my wireless speakers. A waiter placed a single rose on the table and refilled my glass with meticulous care. I savored the notes of bourbon and the smoky chords that drifted through the candlelit room. In that moment of solitary appreciation, I acknowledged that true power, like mastery, often requires patience and the willingness to work anonymously until the moment of revelation. When I returned home, I found a message waiting, an invitation to speak at an international technology conference. The offer included first-class travel and a generous honorarium, all unquestioned recognition of my influence. I accepted with gratitude but withheld details until the time was right. I understood that I now held the agency to choose my own narrative, to reveal as much or as little as I wished. As I settled into bed, the city lights shimmering through the window, I reflected on the arc of my journey. The backseat husband had claimed the wheel. The man in the shadows had emerged into the light. But the man I had become thrived in both worlds, balanced between the hush of confidential strategy and the bright glare of success. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, silence built this empire, and now I will guide it into its greatest era. And with that, I drifted into sleep, already dreaming of the chapters yet to unfold. 6 months had passed since the courthouse drama that reshaped my life, and in that time I had retreated to the shores of Lisbon, trading Seattle's gray skyline for the pastel-hued buildings that clung to the hills overlooking the Atlantic. My villa lay on a quiet street, narrow cobblestones winding between flowering bougainvillea and wrought iron balconies. Here, the horizon stretched indefinitely, and I woke each morning to the hiss of ocean spray and the distant cry of seagulls. It felt as though the world had reset itself, granting me the peace I had long sought beneath Sierra's critical glare. I found solace in routines that honored both my past struggles and my present freedom. Each sunrise, I walked the shoreline, letting the cool saltwater lap at my sneakers as I plotted the next moves for Verdant Edge. On weekends, I experimented in my kitchen, mastering Portuguese custard tarts and perfecting a seafood stew inspired by local fishermen's catch. Evenings were reserved for long conversations with my design partner, Sophia, whose creativity grounded our collaboration in warmth and mutual respect. There were no power plays here, no undercurrents of competition. Only shared vision and genuine friendship. One afternoon, a delivery arrived, a leather-bound copy of Forbes magazine, its cover emblazoned with my portrait and the headline, "The Ghost CEO, From Invisible Husband to Visionary Founder." I turned the glossy pages, reading the feature article that chronicled my journey from sideline spouse to industry luminary. The author had captured the essence of my philosophy: that true strength is forged in silence, that patience and strategy can outlast noise and spectacle. I placed the magazine on my desk, aware of how far I had come and how little of it had required public validation. Later that week, I convened a strategy session for Verdant Edge's expansion into renewable energy applications. The video call connected me to engineers in Tokyo, data scientists in Berlin, and legal advisors in Sao Paulo. As each face appeared on the screen, I felt the satisfaction of shared purpose, a stark contrast to the lonely dejection I once hid behind in Sierra's shadow. We refined algorithms that would optimize wind turbine efficiency and developed AI-driven maintenance schedules for solar farms. Our work promised to leave a meaningful mark on the planet, and every keystroke carried the legacy of my silent ascent. That evening, I hosted a modest gathering on my terrace, inviting a handful of old friends who had stood by me before the empire was revealed. String lights cast a warm glow over long wooden tables, and laughter drifted on the night breeze. We toasted with local wine and shared stories of triumph and hardship. When someone asked about Sierra, I paused, then said simply, "She chose her own path. I chose mine." There was no bitterness in my voice, only a calm acknowledgement that pity has no place where purpose thrives. In the weeks that followed, I received an apology from Sierra via her sister, a message tinged with regret and surprise at what she had lost. I read her words carefully, sensed the vulnerability behind the formal tone, and then deleted the email. There was no satisfaction in her contrition, only the recognition that some bridges, once burned, are best left charred. I had no interest in rehashing old wounds or trading apologies when what mattered was forward momentum. Spring turned to summer, and Verdant Edge prepared for its first major industry conference. I flew to Munich to deliver the keynote address, stepping onto the stage under bright lights and facing an audience of thousands. As I spoke of innovation, resilience, and the quiet power of perseverance, I glimpsed faces in the crowd lit by recognition. And, in some cases, astonishment that the unassuming man behind the company's success stood before them as its leader. Their applause washed over me, not as validation of my worth, but as affirmation of our shared mission. That night, back in my hotel suite overlooking the city's glowing spires, I opened my laptop to messages. Inquiries from aspiring entrepreneurs, invitations to mentor at Stanford, and a personal note from a former classmate praising my humility. I replied to a few. Gracious, concise, genuine, then closed the lid and leaned back in my chair. The gentle hum of the air conditioner reminded me that success need not be thunderous. It could live in the steady pulse of purpose and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you have built something lasting. As I packed for the return flight to Lisbon, I reflected on the arc of my life, the shadowed beginnings, the courtroom confrontation, and the serene present that blossomed from both. I understood now that pity is a fleeting emotion, a hollow salve for wounded pride. Peace, on the other hand, is earned through deliberate action and unwavering focus. I slid my suitcase into the overhead bin, settled into my seat, and closed my eyes, already imagining the horizon that awaited me upon landing. Because I wasn't built for revenge. I was built for legacy, and legacy, once secured, offers its own unshakable peace.